Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. Mr. President of the University, Mr. Representative of the Foreign Ministry of Ukraine, and especially, of course, Madam Lutkovska, with you as the Ombudsperson, we have with all of you, a very close cooperation. I'm happy, of course, that all of you today, students, representatives of the press, of embassies, were finding the way here for our event of launching a very important civil society project. And we as ODIHR, and I want to speak about what ODIHR is doing, ODIHR has long enjoyed a very, very constructive cooperation with civil society in Ukraine, and we try everything what can be done, especially in these times where your country is under aggression, to further promote and help civil society. This is how we see our task. Let me thank you, Professor Melešević, for your opening remarks today. For your opening remarks and for hosting this event is in a very historical and important building. I learned about that this is the oldest building of your university, founded and built in the time of Hetman Mazepa. Later this year, the Academy will be commemorating 400 years of existence, I found out when preparing for this. Founded by Kyiv-Mohyla in 1615 as the Brotherhood Monastery School, it is among the oldest and most prominent centers of scholarship in Eastern Europe, and I'm proud, of course, humbly proud, to be able to speak here. Generations of leaders in the spirit of the Academy's guiding principles have been educated here. Freedom, leadership, and innovation. These principles are critical as Ukraine continues to transform its democratic institutions and strives to promote and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms of its people. The role, therefore, of civil society as a trusted and competent partner in these changes has been continuously cherished and supported by the university, and thank you for that. Anniversaries, ladies and gentlemen, like this are an opportunity to celebrate our collective purpose and achievements. They also bring in reflections on challenges we face and tasks that remain ahead. This year is special because 2015 marks anniversaries of several events that have laid a foundation for democratic governance and human rights as we know them today. As I mentioned those historic events, I will look at them in a broader context today in this lecture, because I think it is very important that we see this broader context of crisis and transitions in which they are happening. It is often in such times of challenge that we are inspired to seek new opportunities and to embark on transformational changes. Ladies and gentlemen, the Chinese use two brush strokes to write the words crisis, just two. One brush stroke stands for danger, the other for opportunity. Often in the recent history, wars, conflicts, and dramatic changes in the political landscape brought about major advancements in democracy and human rights. 100 years ago, decades of relative peace and progress were interrupted by the First World War beginning in 1914, followed by 30 years of turmoil ending in the calamity of the Second Global Conflict, as the long and bloody World War II was just coming to an end almost exactly 70 years ago. On the 25th of April, 850 representatives of 50 states, among them the then Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, gathered in San Francisco to set up an international organization that would guarantee lasting peace and security, the United Nations. At least that is what the goal, to guarantee lasting peace and security. It's up to us to judge whether that always happened, but it's especially up to us to improve the rules if that failed. The conference at that time lasted 2 months and resulted in preparing and adopting the Charter of the United Nations. The event that has later become known as the largest international conference in history was also attended by 3,500 advisors and staff, thousands of journalists, etc. But it was only through the pressure from the civil society that the UN Charter at that time included several provisions with historic human rights implications. The principle of self-determination of states, the principle of non-discrimination on the grounds of race, gender, language, religion, the universal respect and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without any distinction, and the pursuit of international cooperation to promote human rights for all people. It is so important to remind that because today the very universality and universal applicability of human rights is at stake. It is being questioned by many partners, be it in China, be it in other countries, and we should remind ourselves that the universal applicability of human rights needs to be defended and upheld. Chapter 8 of the UN Charter has provided the basis for the involvement of regional organizations in maintaining international peace and security, for which the Security Council is primarily responsible. It is under this chapter that the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, as a regional organization covering the area from Vancouver to Vladivostok, the world's largest and most inclusive regional security arrangement has been created back in 1975. And here we come to the next anniversary, 40 years after Helsinki in 1975. The process initiated in that year as an attempt to improve European security architecture and to have some way of finding out of the Cold War confrontation, it culminated in 35 countries at the time signing in August 75 the Helsinki Final Act. It created the then called Conference on Security and Cooperation, CSCE, as a multilateral forum for dialogue and negotiation between East and West. This year, we have the anniversary. The Final Act included the Declaration on Principles Guiding Relations between Participating States. So let me just say, in the OSCE and CSCE, we don't speak of member states, we speak of participating states because legally it's still a conference. So this is the big difference, of course. Terminology sometimes is really crucial. In this case, it is. And this basic act, of course, it's very often referred to as the Helsinki Decalogue. As you know, it prompted in the former Soviet Union, but also in other countries like Czechoslovakia, a lot of human rights groups, then founding after that, Helsinki groups, Charter 77 in the Czech Republic, etc. And because of it is of so vital importance, I will recall the principles here, these 10 principles who in 75 really changed the dynamic of the whole human rights debate all over the OSCE area, and which deep into the society of the Soviet Union at that time had an impact. It was the 10 following principles. First, sovereign equality, respect for the rights inherent in sovereignty. Second, refraining from the threat or use of force. 3, inviolability of frontiers. 4, territorial integrity of states, actual to the present day. 5, peaceful settlement of disputes. 6, non-intervention in internal affairs. 7, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief. And later on in the document also reminded as the right to know about your rights. So it's not enough to have rights, it's important to have a right to know your rights. That is important. We will come back to that when we speak about ODIHR, because our activity and the Ombudsman's as well is about speaking about rights, teaching about rights, outreach. 8, equal rights and self-determination of peoples. 9, cooperation among states. 10, fulfillment in good faith of obligations under international law. This is interesting because this in a term is relativizing number 6, which says that there is a non-intervention in internal affairs, but at the same time it is limited, this non-intervention, by the obligation, of course, that everybody has to stick to what he or she signed. And later in the agreement in Moscow, it was explicitly said that just in case one state is violating its commitments, then certainly there can be also a criticism from the outside without being an illegal interference in internal affairs. This being a very important point. The 3 baskets of the final Helsinki Act, the so-called 3 baskets, are the political and military relations, that's number 1. Number 2, the economic and environmental cooperation, and last not least, the humanitarian and other sectors, especially here, of course, the human rights. They have laid these three baskets, these three dimensions, the foundation for what is now known as the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is with its unique concept of comprehensive security. So a security which is made of a political, military, of an economic, environmental, and of a human rights dimension. Helsinki watch groups, later named after national Helsinki committees, were set up, as I said, as I told you, follow the progress, following the signature of the Helsinki Act. And this, of course, for example, also led in Ukraine to the foundation of the Ukrainian Helsinki Group, which was among the first ones established already back in 1976. With the collapse of the communist state systems in Eurasia, in the Eurasian area, 1990, 1998, 1999, the challenges that the CSCE was presented with underwent a radical transformation. Again, the new situation created an opportunity for a fundamental change. The creation of a genuine transatlantic system of cooperative security appeared finally possible. To symbolically close the Cold War chapter of European history and address the issues facing the new Europe, the CSCE states decided to convene a second summit after Helsinki. The summit took place in November 1990 in Paris, with 34 participating states present, one less than in Helsinki 15 years previously, because the two Germanys had been reunited just a few weeks prior to the summit. But with the Soviet Union still existing, therefore, of course, still only 34 states. The participating states adopted back then in 1990 the very basic charter which still is governing our affairs in the OSCE, the Charter of Paris, or as it was called, Charter of Paris for a New Europe. It called upon the CSCE to play its part in managing the historic change taking place in Europe and responding to the new challenges of the post-Cold War period. In the Charter, the participating states explicitly recognized the major role that civil society plays in the achievement of the CSCE objectives and made a commitment to facilitate their work and involve civil society in the activities and new structures of the CSCE. And let me say, as a German, without the strengthened civil society in Eastern Germany, and strengthened exactly because of the CSCE principles, without the strong role and protest of the civil society in the GDR, we probably would have never seen, I'm absolutely sure, the German reunification. So we know what and whom we have to thank for that. So civil society is indispensable also in promoting reform in your country, in my country, and I'm sure in all over the OSCE area. This year we celebrate, as I said, the 25th anniversary of the Paris Summit. For me personally, this Silver Jubilee is the most important one because the Charter of Paris for the New Europe gave birth to one of the first standing institutions of the OSCE, and this is exactly our office, the Office for Free Elections in Warsaw, as it was called in the beginning. And of course you see our logo, the ODIHR tree, the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. It is well, of course, connected with the question of observation, of monitoring both human rights and elections. Therefore, the eyes, of course, not in a way, of course, being Big Brother, but first, of course, looking at each other, peer review, having an expert view from the outside. That is the idea behind it, to have a multiple, as large as possible community looking at things in order to make it difficult to hide things. If I were asked to use just a couple of words to describe what ODIHR is and what it does, I would say human dimension, independent and autonomous institution, and specialized work. Originally, the human dimension of security, and please keep that word, human dimension of security. A lot of people speak about security. In the OSCE, there is no security without the human dimension of security. And therefore, the three dimensions are so important: political, military, economic, and human rights aspect of security. This of course, this human dimension, described in terms such as human contact, cultural exchange, was only in the beginning vaguely linked to democracy, rule of law and human rights. At least we had it in the Decalogue, but it was vague. But with democratic transitions in Portugal, 1986, Spain, 86, and Greece already in 81, in the early 1980s, and with the collapse of the socialist regimes throughout Central and Eastern Europe that began, of course, later in the 80s, the notion of human dimension really started to expand. The Charter of Paris therefore made a direct link between peace, security, justice, and cooperation, and the advancement of democracy, respect for and effective exercise of human rights. Consequently, the mandate of our office, ODIHR, the primary OSCE human dimension institution, had also broadened from the initial focus on only free elections to assisting participating states to ensure full respect for human rights in all areas, also outside elections and beyond elections, and fundamental freedoms, to abide by the rule of law, to promote principles of democracy, and, I quote from the original charter, to build, strengthen, and protect democratic institutions, as well as promote tolerance throughout society. Well, you will say quite a lot. Yes, indeed. And we are really challenging this because sometimes with a very small budget, it's extremely difficult to cover all these areas. Today, ODIHR's Human Dimension portfolio covers 5 broad thematic areas on which we focus. Elections, certainly, that was the starting point. Democratization, human rights, especially human rights monitoring, tolerance and non-discrimination. Here we have all the areas of how we can fight hate crime and fighting anti-Semitism. And certainly also this is a special area where ODIHR is active and where we have the broadest commitments in the OSCE area, that is activities for the protection of Roma. ODIHR is an autonomous and independent institution of the OSCE. How is that possible? Well, we are part of the OSCE, but nevertheless, we are not under the Secretary General. We are supervised by Vienna. We are an independent organization within the OSCE and reporting directly to the Ministerial Council, who is my supervisor, represented by the Permanent Council of the OSCE. That gives us a very strong mandate because we can speak out when necessary and we don't need to ask for permission before we do something. In my capacity as director of ODIHR, I regularly address the Permanent Council and the other OSCE bodies. We especially closely cooperate with the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, who are our national partners in monitoring elections and human rights. But ODIHR's work, such as the election and these monitorings, are not subject, as I said, to the explicit approval of the Permanent Council. This is important because sometimes I see that, especially in Ukraine, where you have so many actors of OSCE working, therefore it's very important, therefore, to highlight also the differences. When the special monitoring mission in the East, of course, wants to do something, it always needs the special permission, of course, when it comes to increasing it, of the Permanent Council. We have a given mandate, for example, for election observation, so we don't have explicitly to ask for permission for that. With the Permanent Council, we just need an invitation by the government, which is, and we are in close contact on that, certainly a given. ODIHR's autonomous status is therefore vital in sustaining credibility and objectivity of our work. Let us remember that ODIHR activities are fully in line, therefore, with the Helsinki Final Act, the Charter of Paris, and nearly every other document pertaining to the human dimension, because nearly all documents are about that. And therefore, of course, we very much try always exactly to stick to that mandate. I say that especially because some partners in OSCE, especially those who are critical of the human dimension and human rights, of course, would like us to do less in that area. But we certainly will not do, because we think that upholding this area is important. ODIHR is a specialized institution and a key human dimension standard setter within the OSCE. What are we doing, of course, is especially focused on regularly organizing meetings and seminars concerned with the implementation of the human dimension commitments. And it's not we who signed these commitments, it was the 57 states. 57, that is the actual number. You saw 34 in the beginning, now 57. They did sign the Charter of Paris. They committed themselves to fulfill, and it's our task to remind them that they have to fulfill these commitments. And certainly we cooperate with the OSCE field operations, such as, for example, the project coordinator in Ukraine, which is very active, of course, who is very active in your country. We cooperate with them, and in areas where democratic institutions and human rights require external support, we try to mutually reinforce our activities. The project that we are launching today, ladies and gentlemen, applies ODIHR's specialized expertise in human rights monitoring, parliamentary ethic, political party financing, women's political participation, democratic lawmaking, and hate crime reporting, fight against hate crimes. All this to contribute and support Ukraine's democratic reforms currently going on. Ladies and gentlemen, the Charter of the United Nations was based on faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, end of quote, and aimed to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained. Through the Helsinki Final Act, the participating states aimed to establish conditions, I quote, conditions in which their people can live in true and lasting peace, free from any threat or attempt against their security, end of quote, and therefore adapted the Helsinki Decalogue. No miracle took place then, but it was in this Helsinki spirit that a forward-looking attitude was adopted and made change possible. The Charter of Paris for a New Europe proclaimed that the era of confrontation and division of Europe has ended and pledged full commitment of the participating states to the Helsinki Decalogue. Indeed, there is a lot to be proud of, but of course we all see that in reality a lot of things have come differently in different parts, of course, of our history, be it in the wars, the bloody civil wars in the 90s in the former Yugoslavia, or of course also in the very, very tragic events happening also in your country. Therefore, yes, we are again facing the most serious security crisis in the OSCE region since the end of the Cold War. The founding principles of the UN Charter and Helsinki, I was quoting them, reaffirmed in Paris, from the respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity of states, and inviolability of frontiers, to refraining from the threat of use of force. All this, of course, have been violated since the beginning of last year. This is the reality. We may be asking ourselves whether we should even celebrate all these round anniversaries when the events that laid foundation for the world's order seem to have lost relevance to today's reality. We may be questioning the very letter of the UN and OSCE charters because today there seems to be less room for peaceful cooperation in the spirit of respect for international law. To those who ask such questions, I would answer, where there is danger, there is also an opportunity. Just because a principle is violated, it does not mean it becomes irrelevant. Recent events in Ukraine point to the continued applicability of the UN and OSCE charters if properly followed by each of the 57 OSCE participating states. The Helsinki Final Act could very well be the path to continuous years of improved security and cooperation, freedom and justice for the citizens in the OSCE area. We must make all efforts to maintain and strengthen the direct link between peace, security, justice, and cooperation, and the advancements of democracy, respect for, and effective exercise of human rights. No, we don't have too much rules. We have not enough respect for the rules. Ladies and gentlemen, ODIHR therefore attaches great importance to its relationship with civil society, our classical partner. Since early years of existence, ODIHR has been the main institutional channel for contacts between the OSCE and civil society. Strengthening civil society in countries of transition has been a key focus on our activities. In conflict-affected areas, ODIHR works to support reconciliation efforts to bring together actors from different parties involved, building bridges, strengthening awareness of national and international human rights. ODIHR has been involved in reconstruction in the Western Balkans at large, in civil society, and we can bring a lot of experience in this area. We encourage contribution by civil society and citizen observer groups to the conduct of democratic elections. We support the civil society's role to the processes of democratic institution building and the protection of human rights. We also seek to establish constructive dialogue between NGOs and state representatives. Let me give some examples. One of them is, of course, our civil society partners from all 57 participating states regularly attend our Human Dimension meetings and seminars. These events have provided NGOs with new opportunities for establishing contact and engaging in free and open dialogue in debate with states. This is crucial because usually when conferences of states are meeting, the access is strictly regulated, and usually you cannot just go there, ask a question to a government. It's different in OSCE. We have once a year in Warsaw the famous Human Dimension implementation meeting where every NGO without prior registration can go and ask governments questions and in public. This is very important, and we fight very hard to defend that. Second example, a very important example, ODIHR is perhaps most known for its election observation, the most visible of our activities, in which our office has developed a considerable body of experience. Established in 2001, ODIHR's Diversification Fund allows civil society representatives now from 17 states, including Ukraine, by the way, to take part in our electoral observation missions. And in addition, of course, we are further enlarging that. In this year, we are happy that we are able to send a needs assessment mission, which is always the basis for an electoral observation in every country in the OSCE, from the smallest one to have elections, Andorra, to the largest one in Canada, from Tashkent in Uzbekistan to certainly, of course, also, at least that is, of course, that we openly said that, of course, we would also be ready, of course, to help in observing the local elections, certainly in Ukraine. But, of course, sometimes we are hitting limits, because our budget, as I said, is very small. So sometimes there are elections which we would like to cover, but still are not able financially to cover. Therefore, this is certainly one of our challenges, to make the right choices and to set the right priorities in times of a small budget. A third example, ODIHR builds capacity and supports meaningful systemic dialogue and participation of civil society in qualitative democratic lawmaking processes and strengthening the rule of law. We promote and support a consistent application of quality criteria for legislation. We offer states, participating states, to issue legal opinion on draft laws. Many participating states, of course, are making very active use of that, presenting draft laws for us, waiting for our legal opinion, and of course, being provided then from our side to the best of our knowledge with such an opinion. And we have made very, very good experiences in very close cooperation, especially with transition states who today are already members of the EU and still, of course, are working with us in that way of having legal opinions from ODIHR. This could be also stretched to the example of doing trial monitoring. Recently, we did a very substantial trial monitoring of the processes going on against 17 persons in Georgia after the last change of government. The trial monitoring, of course, was very important because there were rumors about political justice going on in Georgia. Our findings in the trial monitoring in these processes produced critical results, but without hinting to a political justice, but nevertheless highlighting enormous needs for increased transparency of the role of the general prosecutor. So you see, it is also, of course, very much into legal details what we are doing outside of electoral monitoring when it comes to our classical authorities. And as I said, our key partners in that are certainly also the other institutions of the OSCE, especially the representative for the freedom of the media, especially the High Commissioner on National Minorities and the Parliamentary Assembly. The three other classical institutions of the OSCE are our close partners in that. Another example, of course, what I could mention is this year where we have the 15th anniversary of the very important UN Security Council Resolution 1325, Women, Peace and Security, and the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Beijing Declaration, where we have the United Nations Fourth World Foreign Conference on Women. These important documents have built a foundation for gender balance and women's political participation that are essential to upholding and promoting democratic values. We can be proud of how much has been accomplished in all these spheres in the OSCE region in the last 2 decades. But we also have to be mindful of remaining challenges. The Beijing target for women's political participation was set at 30%, and the recommended Council of Europe's target is 40%, yet the current rate of women's representation in the OSCE is still below those standards. It's around 25%. In Ukraine, only 11.8% of women are in the Verkhovna Rada. If current trends persist, it's estimated that it will take at least 50 years, 2 generations, to reach gender parity unless we collectively address the problem of women's underrepresentation. In 2011, ODIHR published a baseline study, Gender Equality in Elected Office, an action plan. We have also developed a range of tools to support our work in these areas: the Handbook on Promoting Women's Participation in Political Parties, the Handbook for National Human Rights Institutions on Women's Rights and Gender Equality, etc., etc., just to give you some examples. And one more in this area, of course, let me mention what we are doing in human rights monitoring. One of our classical activities a year ago, a year ago, March, April, together with the OSCE High Commissioner for Human Rights, we carried out the human rights assessment mission to Ukraine, including Crimea, then still including Crimea. ODIHR reports are recognized as meeting high standards of accuracy, and this report, I think at that time, was very crucial at showing clearly that there was no systematic or no violation of the rights of ethnic Russians in Crimea. ODIHR believes that allowing the voices of human rights defenders and civil society to be heard, even when these, of course, are uncomfortable voices. And therefore, and I know that's uncomfortable, we have very clearly indicated our readiness also to do again a monitoring on the human rights situation in Crimea. I think it would be needed. I think it would be necessary. Also, not only, but also because of the situation of the Crimean Tatars and certainly, of course, of all other groups. We think that, therefore, also take the issue of hate crimes, and that will be my last example of our activities. Fighting against hate crimes is also one of the key areas where we would like to make our work well known. Hate crimes today are criminal acts motivated by bias or prejudice towards particular groups of people. And believe me, this is something which happens everywhere over the OSCE area. Developed democracies, as they call themselves sometimes, well, that is always quite a relative topic, but they all have their way to go, including my own state, Germany. Of course, indeed, this is a big issue. To be considered a hate crime, the offense must meet 2 criteria. The first is that the act constitutes an offense under criminal law. Secondly, the act must have been motivated by bias. Even though the issue of bias-motivated violence had been discussed since the time the Charter of Paris was drafted, it took almost 30 years to adopt in 2009 this common internationally recognized definition of hate crimes, where, as I said, we are extremely active, and our office publishes an annual hate crime report, an overview of information from governments, NGOs, civil society, released for the last time, of course, on 16th of November of 2014. That is the International Tolerance Day. Last year, 109 NGOs, including a lot of them from Ukraine, submitted information for the report, and therefore, of course, we thank all of you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, these were some highlights from the countless activities we conduct. I've chosen these because they reflect well the scope also of the Ukraine Civil Society project that we are officially launching today. I can assure you that the conflict in and around Ukraine remains at the center of the attention. But we cannot forget that peace and security are intrinsically linked with justice and cooperation, the advancement of democracy and respect for and effective exercise of human rights. OSCE states made this link explicitly back in the Helsinki Act and the Charter of Paris. Our Ukrainian partners consulted for the project's 2015 working plan. For this project's working plan repeatedly said that comprehensive, cooperative, equal and indivisible security cannot be achieved at the expense of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Where there is danger, as I said, there is an opportunity. There is also an opportunity here in Ukraine. We see this more clearly than anywhere else. Ukraine's new government, new parliament, both freely elected, is the most reform-oriented government in the country's history. Certainly, there's always more to do, clearly, yes, but that is also important to state. Working under very challenging circumstances, the government and the parliament are engaging with civil society as they take critical steps to tackle corruption, strengthen governance and maintain stability. We in ODIHR are committed to work together with our partners in the Ukrainian government and parliament and the civil society partners to further build on this strong foundation. In our project, we are using ODIHR's experience and expertise to enhance the important role civil society can play in the environment of transition and change, and especially also on the regional and local level. We will work in this project closely with the Parliament. The Commissioner for Human Rights is here, and I'm very happy that she was joining us today to assist human rights defenders through training and support in networking, collective action, to monitor and report on the human rights situation, including, as I said, in Crimea and the East. We will work with civil society, the Parliament, also on the development of a model parliamentary ethics regime, a very interesting and important project, a model parliamentary ethics regime on advancing women's political participation and on political party legislation and financing. We will support the Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine to learn, in this case, from Poland's good practices in financial reporting, disclosure, monitoring and oversight functions of political finance regulators. We will also support civil society, the Commissioner for Human Rights and the Parliamentary Committee for Human Rights of the Rada to develop a checklist for assessing human rights impact of key policies and draft legislation. We will offer training and opportunities for dialogue and joint initiatives to our civil society and criminal justice partners on identifying and addressing hate crimes and on reliable hate crime data collection. Through these activities, we will try to enhance effective mechanisms of multi-stakeholder dialogue with civil society as a competent and trusted actor to address key human dimension issues in Ukraine, in line with Ukraine's OSCE commitments and international standards. Ladies and gentlemen, in a multi-player environment such as of today's world and today's Ukraine, ODIHR believes that strategic partnership is an imperative for effective management and impact. Therefore, we focus strongly on partnership, collaboration and coordination with those who, like ODIHR, are committed to support Ukraine through the times of transition. Other members of the OSCE family, the United Nations, the Council of Europe, and many others alike. And of course, as I mentioned, also with the project coordinator here based in Kyiv. Our project is not an end in itself. We are committed to ensure that these activities are reinforcing those of others and that together they all support Ukraine along the road of transforming the country into a stable and prosperous European democracy. As our predecessors said in the Charter of Paris, ours is a time for fulfilling the hopes and expectations our peoples have cherished for decades. Steadfast commitment to democracy based on human rights and fundamental freedoms, prosperity through economic liberty and social justice, and equal security for all countries. I thank you for your attention. I thank you for being here today, discussing with us later, and I'm especially looking forward for your question, critical ones, supporting ones, no, but especially for the critical ones, because discussion and exchange, that is the most important part. Thank you very much. Dziękuję.